In 1974, an ultra-dimensional being just might have impersonated an evil deity. Several people reported that a tall, horned entity materialized out of thin air. The Catholic Church has chalked this up to a demon attack, but a little-known theory claims that these types of attacks actually come from ultra-dimensional entities.
Among the denizens of the multiverse are what we call parasites. They seem to be life forms of 9 or more different species that can move between parallel worlds. They feed upon negative energies produced by humans: anger, fear, hatred, isolation, and other divisive conditions. In our paranormal work, we encounter them all the time, and we clearly see them as multiversal life forms adapted by nature to find food in not just their own world, but in many parallel worlds as well.
These entities are not bound by the same space and time that you and I are, and the only reason that they come here is to scare the crap out of us, so that they can feed on our negative emotions. Our consciousness, however, is like this impenetrable barrier that they just can't breach unless we open the door. So they often pick the weakest link in a family, weasel their way into that mind, usually promising good things at first. Once they have their claws into that person, then they begin creeping their way into the minds of the rest of the family. And that's when the terrorizing begins, slow and steady, building the negative belief and fear as they go. This particular case began in 1973, and it unfolded in a way that carried all of the hallmarks of a textbook ultra-dimensional parasite attack. First, the family was strict and religious, with a type of religion that some say felt tight, oppressive, and dark. Theodore Donovan, or Ted, the man of the house, worked as a machine designer while his wife Ellen stayed home and took care of the family. Their children were 19-year-old Patty and 15-year-old Brian. The crack began with Patty. She was different, with real dysfunctional challenges. Emotionally, she was closer in age to a 10-year-old than to a 19-year-old. And because of her condition, she was brooding, withdrawn, and she virtually had no friends. Well, late one night in February of 1973, while the rest of the house slept, Patty, feeling lonely and bored, broke out the Ouija board, placed it on the floor of her room, rested her fingers on the planchette, and then she asked one simple question. Is anyone there?
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
Using a Ouija board? It's like using multiversal dynamite that can blow holes in dimensional boundaries. It's like you're ringing the dinner bell.
Patty had just asked the Ouija board if anyone was there, and whether she moved this planchette subconsciously or something else moved it, somehow it found its way to yes. Well, from that night forward, Patty waited until everyone was asleep, and she contacted this same personality every night. It told her that it was the spirit of a teenage boy who had died in the area a few years earlier. It complimented her endlessly. You looked beautiful in that brown dress today, Patty. You're so much prettier than all of those other girls.
Deceptive beings masquerade as the spirits of dead friends and relatives, and they will tell you exactly what they think you want to hear as they seek to get their claws into you.
This spirit played on her emotions with lines like, "You make me so happy, honey. I'd love to marry you, if I could." Night after night, it drew her in deeper and deeper, listening to the details of her day, and then sharing what it claimed were the stories of its own lonely existence. Well, it wasn't long before Patty became emotionally dependent on these conversations. The spirit seemed kind, understanding, and even protective. And then, in February of 1974, she took the relationship a step further, and she asked this boy if he could see her future. Well, the planchette moved across the board with lightning speed, and detailed answers of specific events that were supposed to come true in her life, and even gave exact birth dates of the 3 children that she would have by 1978. Now, here's the interesting part. After the horror of this particular case was over, according to Patty, all of these predictions came true. To any being living in our ordinary three-dimensional reality, such foresight seems impossible. But to a higher dimensional intelligence, one that operates outside of our space and time, seeing across the years would be no more difficult than glancing at a map, right?
I have adopted the concept of ultra-terrestrials, beings and forces which coexist with us but are on another time frame. That is, they operate outside the limits of our space-time continuum, yet have the ability to cross over into our reality.
Late Saturday night, March 2nd, 1974, Patty begged the spirit to manifest just once so she could see what her invisible boyfriend actually looked like. Well, the very next morning is when the terrorizing began. This story becomes extremely interesting on Sunday, March 3rd, 1974, because that's when Ted Donovan went outside to start his car, but it wouldn't turn over. When he lifted the hood, he found that the spark plug wires had all been pulled out, and the rubber hoses had been unfastened, and the fan belt had been cut. Well, not long after this, Patty tried to start her own car. It too refused, but with hers there were no obvious signs as to why. So they towed her car to the local garage, where mechanics discovered that internal engine parts had been disassembled somehow. That same week, other acts of apparent vandalism appeared all around the house. Someone completely tore the back doorbell out of its housing. Shrubs had been yanked out, roots and all. And now, check this out. A 6-foot cast iron pipe on top of the roof had been bent to a perfect 90-degree angle. Now, this cast iron pipe was way too thick and could not have been bent like this without the aid of some type of a tool. Well, at first, the family blamed neighborhood kids, and the police were called. Officers came out, they examined the damage, and promised that they would keep an eye on the property during night patrols. Then, on Friday, March 8th, Ted found that one of his car tires was flat. Then Patty's car suffered a flat. The next day, it happened again, but this time it appeared that the tire had been slashed with a knife. Meanwhile, for some strange reason, the Ouija board no longer responded to Patty. Her new invisible boyfriend had simply vanished. She had been ghosted by a ghost. Every night she tried, but the planchette simply slid to goodbye. By the middle of March, the damage had become so severe that Ted made a second complaint to the police. He pointed out the ruined garden, the exterior destruction, the apparent intrusion into a locked garage to slash tires. He also claimed that he had even heard someone pounding on the outside of the house. Well, the officers made a second report, but all they could do was just continue to watch the property. Then one evening, while Ted, Ellen, and Brian were in the kitchen, they heard something smash against a wall somewhere inside of the house. So they went to investigate. In Brian's room, they found an 18-inch hole in the wall. Now, here's the interesting and strangest part. The blow had been delivered from the inside of the wall, knocking the plaster outward into the bedroom. Well, that was the turning point for the Donovans. Whatever was happening, it seemed to be much more than just your run-of-the-mill vandalism. And that night, when everyone went to bed, they couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening, and they all started hearing scratches coming from inside of the walls. Well, Ted first thought that maybe it was a squirrel, or some small animal had somehow gotten into the house. The scratches became so prevalent and so annoying that he actually got out of bed, switched on all of the lights, and then spent the next few hours checking the house from top to bottom. But he found no obvious entry points where an animal could have gotten in. Yet, these same weird, troublesome noises continued all week long. But this was just the beginning. Well, the family had no idea just how crazy this whole thing was going to get.
Nearly all parasite cases I've witnessed start small, with bumps on the wall and other minor incidents. As the family becomes more agitated, puts out more energy, the parasites become stronger and stronger. able to be more present in our conscious reality.
It was the third week in March 1974 that these strange events escalated to the point that the family could no longer explain them away in any rational terms. Still, they did not want to believe that something otherworldly was actually going on. But soon, they'd have no choice. First, every night, something would bang on the outside of the house. It started somewhat mildly, but eventually it became so hard and so loud that the entire house shook with every banging. Several times, Ted went outside to investigate, but he never found anything. Still, the pounding continued. Then, before the week was over, sharp, jarring raps could be heard coming from somewhere inside of the house as well. Well, this quickly escalated until there were two powerful banging sounds, one still coming from the outside, and the other one, the new one, now coming from somewhere on the inside of the house. At first, Ted thought that, maybe it had something to do with the heating system. That house's heating operated on an old radiator style of heating. Water would be boiled in the basement, then piped throughout the house to radiators in each bedroom. So he spent the entire weekend nearly tearing the house apart, looking for the source of those noises, but found nothing. Maybe it had something to do with the furnace. So the next morning, desperate for peace and quiet, he called a furnace repairman. The furnace repairman came out, studied the furnace, and declared that it was in perfect working order. But he too heard those pounding noises, and ultimately he spent 19 hours in the Donovan house trying to figure out where those poundings were coming from. In the end, all he could do was tell Ted and Ellen that whatever these sounds were, they weren't coming from the furnace. Then, around 10 o'clock that Sunday night, March 31st, with those unstoppable poundings still echoing through the house, Ted, Ellen, Brian, and Patty were all in Ted and Ellen's bedroom watching television. At this point, the children did not want to be alone unless they absolutely had to be, and this was the quietest place in the house. Well, as everyone sat there, all of a sudden the lights flickered off and on 3 times in succession. Then the television went dead. And as it did, the Donovans watched as the heavy wooden bedroom dresser eerily began to levitate. This loaded dresser, 6 feet long and weighing probably a couple 100 pounds, began violently twisting back and forth. Perfume, cosmetic bottles, and other things dropped onto the floor and broke, and then the dresser gently set itself back down. Well, a moment later, one of the drawers slid open, waited for a second, and then slammed forcibly shut again. And soon, all of the drawers were slamming in and out all by themselves. As the Donovans sat there frozen in terror, the drawers finally came to rest. But the chaos, it wasn't over yet. No, a heavy chair full of folded clothes lifted some 3 foot off of the floor, tilted onto its side, dumped the clothes off onto the floor, and then fell on top of those clothes with a heavy thud. Next, one after the other, pictures actually lifted from their hooks, drifted away from the wall, and then floated in a circle around the room. What? Then the bed with Ted and Ellen on it collapsed. And at the same time, the floating pictures dropped to the floor, and then all of the paranormal activity ceased. Well, the family just sat there in silence, not really knowing what to do. And although there was this peace for the moment, it would not last. No, later that night, after everyone went to bed, a kitten was heard meowing in the spare bedroom. Moments later, that meowing transmuted into the sound of a baby crying. I thought that was extremely eerie and odd. Then the pounding resumed, this time louder than before. And right in the middle of all of this insanity, a blood-curdling scream came from Patty's bedroom. She said, "There's someone in here, with me." Patty's scream cut through the house like a knife. Well, Ted rushed into her room with his heart pounding, but he found Patty alone. "Something was just here," she gasped. "Something was in the room with me." Well, the family was now completely terrified, and something in the air felt as if it was completely satisfied. Well, the very next day was April Fool's Day, and if there was this ultra-dimensional being involved, toying with the family, Well, then that might explain the rocks, because it literally rained rocks. Stones descended right out of the sky, pelting the Donovan's roof and rolling off onto the lawn. When one of these rocks crashed through the back window, Ellen immediately phoned Ted at work. Fatigued from the night before, he told her to call the police and that he would come straight home. By the time that Ted arrived, the police were already on the scene, standing with the family and completely befuddled at the extraordinary spectacle of stones falling out of the sky onto the home. The rock shower lasted for about an hour before it finally stopped. Desperate and at the end of his rope, Ted asked the officers what they think he should do. Call a priest, they offered, because whatever this was, it was way above their pay grade. Well, Ted did some research, found the right phone number, and then called the Catholic Church. He explained the situation and all the stuff that the family was going through, and the priest promised that he would be there within the hour. But now, how's this for mischief? Just before he arrived, the activity abruptly and completely stopped. As Ted showed the priest through the house, stepping over broken furniture and debris, the house remained completely silent. The priest's only conclusion was that someone in that house was mentally disturbed and that Ted needed to call a psychiatrist. Then, as soon as the priest left, the pounding and the chaos resumed, this time with a fresh fury. Well, Ted stood in his kitchen, staring blank-faced out the window, when he suddenly noticed the monastery down the street, and hope instantly flooded his mind. The monks, they would know what to do. So he walked up the road to the retreat house, where a kindly middle-aged monk ushered him inside. Ted explained the situation and then asked desperately if the monk would come back to his house and see for himself. Well, the monk agreed, and a short time later, he was inside, surveying the damage, listening to the random poundings, and reading the different obscenities that had been scribbled all throughout the home. After a minute, he sat Ted down, and he explained that these disturbances were not being caused by some simple ghost. No, this was a deliberate terrorizing caused by a specific type of spirit, one that delighted in tormenting humans.
We see parasite action among individuals and families. Their food seems to be the energy that we put out when we're angry, fearful, hateful, or otherwise negative and divisive.
Finally, on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1974, Ted received help from a couple who were experienced in investigating these types of cases. One of the first things that they noticed when they pulled up were the stones that blanketed the front yard. Inside, expensive furniture stood chipped and stained. Marks covered the walls, and a foul odor permeated the air. One of the investigators sensed a presence that was so threatening that she had to fight the urge with everything she had not to run back outside. It seemed to her that a wild fury was building and that the worst was yet to come. After interviewing the family, the investigators learned that Patty had been using that Ouija board to communicate with what she believed was the spirit of a teenage boy. Well, that led investigators to spend the next half hour explaining the gravity of what the family was facing. The case, they told them, was far more serious than they had first imagined. They decided that the quickest solution was to get a God-fearing priest back into that house. A few hours later, just after sunset, Father Jason Bradford, a faith-filled young priest in his early 30s who had studied this sort of phenomenon before, arrived at the Donovans' home. When he walked through the door, the activity was still growing strong, with scratches, poundings, and the levitation of small objects. Well, to test whether the poundings were intelligent rather than just some unclassified power of nature, the investigator pounded twice on the wall. 2 poundings replied. So he pounded 4 times in quick succession, and 4 quick raps sounded from the floor and then from the table. Obviously, there was an intelligence behind this activity. While the investigators asked Father Jason if he would perform a blessing in each room. When that was done, the power and the frequency of these poundings decreased. Now, at this point, I'm wondering, is that because of the fact that the priest is doing this? Or is it maybe because in that moment, everyone is feeling just a little bit better, believing that help is finally here, thus taking away the power of these parasites just a little bit? You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Well, the house didn't stay quiet for long. No, over the next week, these poundings slowly grew in intensity again. But interestingly, so did everyone's fear. Something I thought was extremely interesting was this. On Monday, April 29th, while one of the investigators was in Brian's bedroom, she heard a metal pin drop to the floor. Well, she turned around and she looked at the bedroom door, and she watched as the second hinge pin slid out of its socket. Then it too fell to the floor, leaving the door there just balancing without any hinges. Now, check this out. As she stood there watching it, the bedroom door simply dematerialized. A few moments later, it was found in the basement. A physical object had been taken from one location, and a minute later it was transported to another location. Paul Eno and others who followed the same line of thinking might see this as the unmistakable signature of a higher dimensional intelligent being plucking something from one place, pulling it through another dimension, and then placing it down back in our universe in another place. In any case, this was enough for the investigators, and another priest was contacted, and an exorcism was scheduled. The exorcism was scheduled for Thursday, May 2nd, and it seemed as if whatever was in that house did not want that exorcism to take place, because the paranormal activity intensified like crazy, getting stronger every day as that day approached. Things got so bad that by May 1st, the day before the exorcism, everyone was reduced to sleeping in shifts, taking turns patrolling the house, watching out for hazards, because fires and other potential dangers had been popping up here and there. Well, about 10:30 that night, one of the investigators was in the hall when the doorway to the living room began to brighten. A few moments later, the whole doorway was engulfed in a powerful bright light so intense that she had a difficult time looking directly at it. Well, Ted Donovan and the lead investigator were in the living room watching this same thing from the other side of the doorway. In the middle of the light, this figure slowly began to emerge. A few seconds after that, it solidified into the form of an older woman. The lead investigator called out, "Speak to us," but the eerie specter simply studied them individually without replying. It appeared as if it were a ghost, but the investigators, having experience with this sort of thing, stated that no, this was a deception. Well, just then, two chairs suddenly fell over, tumbled toward the lead investigator, rose into the air with their legs pointing toward him, and then pinned him against the wall. The figure watched with a sardonic grin and then vanished. At the same time, the chairs dropped to the floor, but a moment later, a bottle of nail polish levitated and was flung across the room, aiming straight for the lead investigator's head, which it missed by just centimeters. Well, with only 12 hours to go before the exorcism, the family and the investigators kept an all-night vigil. Lights stayed on and pot after pot of coffee was brewed. Finally, outside, birds began chirping as the sun rose on the morning of May 2nd, 1974. At 9:30, the exorcist arrived. Though balding and middle-aged, Father Rourke was powerfully built and looked more like he belonged on the docks than behind a pulpit as a priest. An intense, unsmiling man of God, he removed his purple stole from his black bag, kissed it, and then placed it around his neck. Before beginning the ritual, he individually blessed every person there so that no harm would come to anyone. Then he began the ancient rite, speaking partially in English and partially in Latin. Prayers, psalms, and powerful commands ordering the invading spirit to leave the premises now. For more than an hour, the only sound in the house was the priest's deep, somber voice. Finally came the direct command, with everyone standing in a wide circle in the middle of the living room. Father Rourke, reading in a booming voice, said, "I command thee, thou unclean spirit, tell me thy name or give me a sign, and depart forthwith from this house." And nothing happened. Well, undeterred, Father Rourke repeated the command even more forcefully this time. Suddenly, Ellen Donovan cried out, "There, by the fireplace." As its form slowly became clearer, the family and the investigators, 7 individuals in all, who all swore later that this truly took place, stared at a towering figure, horned head, cloven hooves, and a tail. While at the same moment, the temperature of the room dropped to nearly freezing, and the stomach-turning smell of rotting flesh filled the air. Father Rorik cast holy water on the image and thundered, "Begone in the name of God!" And instantly, the figure vanished. Well, to make a long story short, peace was finally returned to the Donovan house, but only after everyone believed that peace would return. So, what actually happened with this case? Well, try as I may, I have a very difficult time believing that this case actually took place the way it's been reported. Part of my doubt comes from the fact that Amy searched and searched, but she couldn't find a single report from the police tied to this case, or even any newspaper clippings about those rocks falling on the house for an entire day. You would think that something like that would definitely make the news, right? And there were a lot of other things about this case that really didn't set well with me either. But there are some very interesting things to note about the case. First, everyone involved swore that these things actually happened. And to our knowledge, these people have never changed their stories, the priest included. Second, and I thought that this was super interesting, remember how this being predicted Patty's future? Well, according to Patty, all of those predictions came true with eerie accuracy, right down to the very birth dates of her 3 children. Let's go ahead and assume, just for a second, that this case took place just as it's been reported. Well, it began with a simple yes, answering a lonely girl's cry to the universe, asking if anyone was out there. Loneliness can be a very powerful negative emotion. If this parasite theory is correct, well then it just might have opened a door a crack, right? Then the compliments came, and as they were accepted, the presence of this spirit grew stronger, until eventually little annoying anomalies began to take place, and as they did, the other family members found themselves wrapped up in this annoyance. Eventually, this annoyance turned into something more, and everyone's anxiety was so high and their annoyance was so deep that they began to hear strange sounds coming from nowhere. All of it culminating in dematerializing doors and the presence of evil spirits. And then the exorcism appeared to work. But perhaps what really closed that door wasn't that Latin rite. No, maybe this parasite theory is true, and it was the raw power of the family's focused belief, the same power of the human consciousness that had reached across the dimensions and opened that door in the first place. Because if thought and fear can feed these beings, well, then it would stand to follow, right, that thought and faith can starve them. I don't know. In the end, the Donovan story leaves us with a single haunting question. If there are dimensions to other places, perhaps dimensions to hell with parasites that can feed on negative emotions, well then, how thin is the veil between our world and the vast unseen worlds that just might be all around us? Most of us, myself included, are completely in the dark to anything like that. I guess sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't really what hides in the darkness, but rather realizing that that darkness was never really empty to begin with, and that we just might have more power with our emotions to open that door than we think.
I've always found Paul Eno's work on ultra-dimensional entities extremely interesting, and while I couldn't find newspaper articles or police reports about the falling rocks or other paranormal activity on this case, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I've spoken to many people who've had experiences like this and choose to stay anonymous, wanting to avoid the judgment and ridicule. On a positive note, like Eno, I do believe that our thoughts and emotions can influence the world around us. How we think really can make a difference. And you know what else makes a difference? Supporting Damon, Arcana, and I at Buy Me a Coffee. It's like a tip jar for your favorite content creators. And it definitely helps us as we research and film and edit these videos. If you enjoyed this, please consider watching one of the other videos on your screen.